Hello, everyone. I'm back again to read the next two chapters in the Mary Jemison series. Unfortunately, it's not allowing me to share my screen right now. Here we go. So we're now up to chapter 11, Death of Hiakotu, Biography, His Birth, Education, Goes Against the Cherokees, Bloody Battle, his success and cruelties in the French War, Battle at Fort Freeland, Captains Doherty and Boone are killed, his cruelties in the neighborhood of Cherry Valley, Indians remove their general encampment. In 1782, Colonel Crawford is sent to destroy them. They are met by a traitor. There's a battle. Crawford's men surprised. Irregular retreat. Crawford and Dr. Knight taken. Counsel. Crawford condemned and burnt. Aggravating circumstances. Knight is sentenced to be burnt. Is painted by Hiakotu. Is conducted off. His fortunate escape. Hiakotu in the French War takes Colonel Canton. His sentence. Is bound on a wild colt that runs loose 3 days, returns alive, is made to run the gauntlet, gets knocked down, is redeemed and sent home. Hiakotu's enmity to the Cherokees, his height, strength, and speed. In the month of November 1811, my husband, Hiakotu, who had been sick 4 years of the consumption, died at the advanced age of 103 years, as nearly as the time could be estimated. He was the last that remained to me of our family connection, or rather of my old friends with whom I was adopted, except a part of one family which now lives at Tonawanda. Hiakotu was buried decently and had all the insignia of a veteran warrior buried with him, consisting of a war club, tomahawk, and scalping knife, a powder flask, flint, a piece of spunk, a small cake and a cup, and his best clothing. Hiakotu was an old man when I first saw him, but he was by no means enervated. During the term of nearly 50 years that I had lived with him, I received, according to Indian customs, all the kindness and attention that was my due as his wife. Although war and his trade from his youth till old age and decrepitude stopped his career, he uniformly treated me with tenderness, and he never offered me any insult. I have frequently heard him repeat the history of his life from his childhood, and when he came to that part which related to his actions, his bravery and his valor in war, when he spoke of the ambush, the combat, the spoiling of his enemies, and the sacrifice of the victims, his nerves seemed strung with youthful ardor. The warmth of the able warrior seemed to animate his frame and to produce the heated gestures which he had practiced in middle age. He was a man of tender feelings to his friends, ready and willing to assist them in distress, yet as a warrior, his cruelties to his enemies perhaps were unparalleled and will not admit a word of palliation. Hiakotu was born in one of the tribes of the 6 nations that inhabited the banks of the Susquehanna, or rather he belonged to a tribe of the Senecas that made, at the time of the Great Indian Treaty, a part of those nations. He was his own cousin to his farmer's brother, a chief who has been justly celebrated for his worth. Their mothers were sisters, and it was through the influence of farmer's brother that I became Hiakotu's wife. In early life, Hiakotu showed signs of thirst for blood by attending only to the act of war in the use of the tomahawk and scalping knife, and in practicing cruelties upon everything that chanced to fall into his hands, which was susceptible of pain. In that way, he learned to use his implements of war effectually, and at the same time blunted all those fine feelings and tender sympathies that are naturally excited by hearing or seeing a fellow being in distress. He could inflict the most excruciating tortures upon his enemies, and prided himself upon his fortitude in having performed the most barbarous ceremonies and tortures without the least degree of pity or remorse. Thus qualified, when very young, he was initiated into scenes of carnage by being engaged in the wars that prevailed among the Indian tribes. In the year 1731, he was appointed a runner to assist in collecting an army to go against the Catawapes, Cherokees, and other southern Indians. A large army was collected, and after a long and fatiguing march, met its enemies in what was then called the Low, Dark, and Bloody Lands, near the mouth of Red River, in what is now called the state of Kentucky. The Catawapes acknowledges himself unacquainted from Indian history with a nation of this name, but as 90 years have elapsed since the date of this occurrence, it is highly probable that such a nation did exist and that it was absolutely exterminated at that eventful period. And their associates had by some means been apprised of their approach and lay in ambush to take them at once when they should come within their reach and destroy the whole army. The northern Indians, with their usual sagacity, discovered the situation of their enemies, rushed upon the ambuscade, and massacred 1,200 on the spot. The battle continued for 2 days and 2 nights with the utmost severity, in which the northern Indians were victorious and so far succeeded in destroying the Catawapes that they at that time ceased to be a nation. The victors suffered an immense loss in killed, but gained the hunting ground, which was their grand object, though the Cherokees would not give it up in a treaty or consent to make peace. Bows and arrows at that time were in general use, though a few guns were employed. From that time, he was engaged in a number of battles in which Indians only were engaged, and that made fighting his business, till the commencement of the French War. In those battles, he took a number of Indian prisoners, whom he killed by tying them to trees and then setting small Indian boys to shooting at them with their arrows, till death finished the misery of the sufferers, a process that frequently took 2 days for its completion. During the French War, he was in every battle that was fought on the Susquehanna and Ohio rivers, and he was so fortunate as never to have been taken prisoner. At Braddock's defeat, he took 2 white prisoners and burnt them alive in a fire of his own kindling. In 1777, he was in the battle at Fort Freeland in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania. The fort contained a great number of women and children and was defended only by a small garrison. The force that went against it consisted of 100 British regulars, commanded by a Colonel MacDonald, and 300 Indians under Hiakutu. After a short but bloody engagement, the fort was surrendered. The women and children were sent under an escort to the next fort below, and the men and boys taken off by a party of British to the general Indian encampment. As soon as the fort had capitulated and the firing had ceased, Hiakutu, with the help of a few Indians, tomahawked every wounded American while earnestly begging with uplifted hands for quarters. The massacre was but just finished when Captain Doherty and Boone arrived with a reinforcement to assist the garrison. On their arriving in sight of the fort, they saw that it had been surrendered and that an Indian was holding the flag. This so much inflamed Captain Doherty that he left his command, stepped forward, and shot the Indian at the first fire. Another took the flag and had no sooner got it erected than Doherty dropped him as he had the first. A third presumed to hold it, who was also shot down by Doherty. Hiakutu, exasperated at the sight of such bravery, sallied out with a party of the Indians and killed Captain Doherty, Boone, and 14 men at the first fire. The remainder of the 2 companies escaped by taking to flight, and they soon arrived at the fort, which they had left but a few hours before. In an expedition that went out against Cherry Valley and the neighboring settlements, Captain David, a Mohawk Indian, was first and Hiakutu the second in command. The force consisted of several hundred Indians who were determined on mischief and the destruction of the whites. A continued series of wantonness and barbarity characterized their career, for they plundered and burnt everything that came in their way, and they killed a number of persons, among whom were several infants, whom Hiakatu butchered or dashed upon the stones with his own hands. Beside the instances which have been mentioned, he was in a number of parties during the Revolutionary War, where he ever acted a conspicuous part. The Indians, having removed the seat of their depredations and war to the frontiers of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, and the neighboring territories, assembled a large force at Upper Sandusky, their place of general rendezvous, from whence they went out to the various places which they designed to sacrifice. Tired of the desolating scenes that were so often witnessed, and feeling a confidence that the savages might be subdued and an end put to their crimes, the American government raised a regiment consisting of 300 volunteers for the purpose of dislodging them from their cantonment and preventing further barbarities. Colonel William Crawford and Lieutenant Colonel David Williamson, men who had been thoroughly tried and approved, were commissioned by General Washington to take the command of a service that seemed all important to the welfare of the country. In the month of July 1782, well armed and provided with a sufficient quantity of provision, this regiment made an expeditious march through the wilderness to Upper Sandusky, where, as had been anticipated, they found the Indians assembled in full force at their encampment, prepared to receive an attack. As Colonel Crawford and his brave band advanced, and when they had gotten within a short distance from the town, they were met by a white man with a flag of truce from the Indians, who proposed to Colonel Crawford that if he would surrender himself and his men to the Indians, their lives should be spared, but that if they persisted in their undertaking and attacked the town, they should all be massacred to a man. Crawford, while hearing the proposition, attentively surveyed its bearer and recognized in the features one of his former schoolmates and companions, with whom he was perfectly acquainted, by the name of Simon Girty. Girty, but a short time before this, had been a soldier in the American army, in the same regiment with Crawford, but on the account of his not having received the promotion that he expected, he became disaffected, swore an eternal war with his countrymen, fled to the Indians, and joined them as a leader well qualified to conduct them to where they would satiate their thirst for blood upon the innocent, unoffending, and defenseless settlers. Crawford sternly inquired of the traitor if his name was not Simon Girty, and being answered in the affirmative, he informed him that he despised the offer which he had made, and that he would not surrender his army unless he should be compelled to do so by a superior force. Girty returned, and Crawford immediately commenced an engagement that lasted till night, without the appearance of victory on either side, when the firing ceased and the combatants on both sides retired to take refreshment and to rest through the night. Crawford encamped in the woods near a half-mile from the town, where after the sentinels were placed, and each had taken his ration, they slept on their arms, that they might be instantly ready in case they should be attacked. The stillness of death hovered over the little army, and sleep relieved the whole, except the wakeful sentinels, who vigilantly attended to their duty. But what was their surprise when they found late in the night that they were surrounded by the Indians on every side, except a narrow space between them and the town. Every man was under arms, and the officers instantly consulted each other on the best method of escaping, for they saw that to fight would be useless, and that to surrender would be death. Crawford proposed a retreat through the ranks of the enemy in an opposite direction from the town, as being the most sure course to take. Lieutenant Colonel Williamson advised to march directly through the town, where there appeared to be no Indians, and the fires were yet burning. Well, there was no time or place for debates. Colonel Crawford, with 60 followers, retreated on the route that he had proposed by attempting to rush through the enemy. But they had no sooner gotten among the Indians than every man was killed or taken prisoner. Among the prisoners were Colonel Crawford and Dr. Knight, surgeon of the regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Williamson, with the remainder of the regiment, together with the wounded, set out at the same time that Crawford did, went through the town without losing a man, and by the help of good guides arrived at their homes in safety. The next day, after the engagement of the Indians disposed of all their prisoners to the different tribes, except Colonel Crawford and Dr. Knight, but those unfortunate men were reserved for a more cruel destiny. A council was immediately held on Sandusky Plains, consisting of all the chiefs and warriors ranged in their customary order in a circular form, and Crawford and Knight were brought forward and seated in the center of the circle. The council being opened, the chiefs began to examine Crawford on various subjects relative to the war. At length, they inquired who conducted the military operations of the American Army on the Ohio and Susquehanna rivers during the year before, and who had led the army against them with so much skill and so uniform success. Crawford, very honestly and without suspecting any harm from his reply, promptly answered that he was the man who had led his countrymen to victory, who had driven the enemy from the settlements, and by that means had procured a great degree of happiness to many of his fellow citizens. Upon hearing this, a chief who had lost a son in the year before, in a battle where Colonel Crawford commanded, left his station in the council, stepped to Crawford, blacked his face, and at the same time told him that the next day he should be burnt. The council was immediately dissolved on its hearing the sentence from the chief, and the prisoners were taken off the ground and kept in custody through the night. Crawford now viewed his fate as sealed, and despairing of ever returning to his home or his country, only dreaded the tediousness of his death, as commonly inflicted by the savages, and earnestly hoped that he might be dispatched at a single blow. Early the next morning, the Indians assembled at the place of execution, and Crawford was led to the post, the goal of savage torture to which he was fastened. The post was a stick of timber wood placed firmly in the ground, having an arm framed in at the top and extending some 6 or 8 feet from it, like the arm of a signpost. A pile of wood containing about 2 cords lay a few feet from the place where he stood, which he was informed was to be kindled into a fire that would burn him alive, as many had been burnt on the same spot who had been much less deserving than himself. Gertie stood and supposedly looked on the preparations that were making for the funeral of one of his former playmates, a hero by whose side he had fought, of a man whose valor had won laurels which, if he could have returned, would have been strewed upon his grave by his grateful countrymen. Dreading the agony that he saw he was about to feel, Crawford used every argument which his perilous situation could suggest to prevail upon Gertie to ransom him off at any price and deliver him, as it was in his power, from the savages and their torments. Gertie heard his prayers and expostulations and saw his tears with indifference, and finally told the forsaken victim that he would not procure him a moment's respite, nor afford him the most trifling assistance. The colonel was then bound, stripped naked, and tied by his wrists to the arm, which extended horizontally from the post in such a manner that his arms were extended over his head, with his feet just standing upon the ground. This being done, the savages placed the wood in a circle around him at the distance of a few feet, in order that his misery might be protracted to the greatest length, and then kindled it in a number of places at the same time. The flames arose, and the scorching heat became almost insupportable. Again he prayed to Gertie on all the anguish of his torment to rescue him from this fire, or shoot him dead upon the spot. A devilish smile suffused the countenance of Gertie, while he calmly replied to the dying suppliant that he had no pity for his suffering, but that he was then satisfying that spirit of revenge, which for a long time he had hoped to have an opportunity to wreak upon him. Nature now almost exhausted from the intensity of the heat, he settled down a little, when a squaw threw coals of fire and embers upon him, which made him groan most piteously, while the whole camp rung with exultation. During the execution, they manifested all the ecstasy of a complete triumph. Poor Crawford soon died and was entirely consumed. Thus ended the life of a patriot and a hero who had been an intimate friend of General Washington and who shared in eminent degree the confidence of that great good man to whom, in the time of revolutionary perils, the sons of legitimate freedom looked with a degree of faith in his mental resources unequaled in the history of the world. That tragedy being ended, Dr. Knight was informed that on the next day he should be burnt in the same manner that his comrade Crawford had been at Lower Sandusky. Hiakutu who out had been a leading chief in the battle with and in the execution of Crawford, painted Dr. Knight's face black, and then bound and gave him up to 2 able-bodied Indians to conduct to the place of execution. They set off with him immediately and traveled till towards evening, when they halted to encamp till morning. The afternoon had been very rainy, and the storm still continued, which rendered it very difficult for the Indians to kindle a fire. Knight, observing the difficulty under which they labored, made them to understand by signs that if they would unbind him, he would assist them. They accordingly unbound him, and he soon succeeded in making a fire by the application of small dry stuff, which he was at considerable trouble to procure. While the Indians were warming themselves, the doctor continued to gather wood to last through the night, and in doing this, he found a club which he placed in a situation from whence he could take it conveniently whenever an opportunity should present itself in which he could use it effectually. The Indians continued warming until at length the doctor saw that they had placed themselves in a favorable position for the execution of his design, when stimulated by the love of his life. He cautiously took his club and at 2 blows knocked them both down. Determined to finish the work of death which he had so well begun, he drew one of their scalping knives, with which he beheaded and scalped them both. He then took a rifle, tomahawk, and some ammo, and directed his course for home, where he arrived without having experienced any difficulty on his journey. The next morning, the Indians took the track of their victim and his attendants to go to Lower Sandusky, and there execute the sentence which they had pronounced upon him. But what was their surprise and disappointment when they arrived at the place of encampment, where they found their trusty friends scalped and decapitated, and that their prisoner had made his escape. Chagrined beyond measure, they immediately separated and went in every direction in pursuit of their prey, but after having spent a number of days unsuccessfully, they gave up the chase and returned to their encampment. That soon after the Revolutionary War, Dr. Knight published a pamphlet containing an account of the battle at Sandusky and of his own sufferings. My information on this subject was derived from a different quarter. The subject of this narrative, in giving the account of her last husband, Hiakutu, referred us to Mr. George Jemison, who, as it will be noticed, lived on our land a number of years, and who had frequently heard the old chief relate the story of his life, particularly that part which related to his military career. Mr. Jemison, on being inquired of, gave the foregoing account partly from his own personal knowledge, and the remainder from the account given by Hiakutu. Mr. Jemison was in the battle, was personally acquainted with Colonel Crawford, and one that escaped with Lieutenant Colonel Williamson. We have no doubt of the truth of the statement, and have therefore inserted the whole account as an addition to the historical facts which are daily coming into the state of preservation in relation to the American Revolution. In the time of the French War, in an engagement that took place on the Ohio River, Hiakutu took a British colonel by the name of Simon Canton, whom he carried to the Indian encampment. A council was held, and the colonel was sentenced to suffer death by being tied on a wild colt with his face toward its tail, and then having the colt turned loose to run wherever it pleased. He was accordingly tied on, and the colt let loose, agreeable to the sentence. The colt ran 2 days and then returned with its rider, still alive. The Indians, thinking that he would never die in that way, took him off and made him run the gauntlet 3 times. But in the last race, a squaw knocked him down, and he was supposed to have been dead. He, however, recovered and was sold for $50 to a Frenchman, who sent him as a prisoner to Detroit. On the return of the Frenchman to Detroit, The colonels besought him to ransom him and give or set him at liberty with so much warmth, and promised with so much solemnity to reward him as one of the best of benefactors, if he would just let him go, that the Frenchman took his word and sent him home to his family. The colonel remembered his promise, and in a short time sent his deliverer $150 as a reward for his generosity. Since the commencement of the Revolutionary War, Hiakotu has been in 17 campaigns, 4 of which were in the Cherokee War. He was so great an enemy to the Cherokees and so fully determined upon their subjugation that on his march to their country, he raised his own army for those 4 campaigns and commanded it, and also superintended its subsistence. In one of those campaigns, which continued 2 whole years without intermission, he attacked his enemies on the Mobile, drove them to the country of the Creek Nation, where he continued to harass them, till being tired of war, he returned to his family. He brought home a great number of scalps, which he had taken from the enemy, and ever seemed to possess an unconquerable will that the Cherokees might be utterly destroyed. Toward the close of his last fighting in that country, he took 2 squaws, whom he sold on his way home for money to defray the expense of his journey. Hiakotu was about 6'4" or 5 inches high, large-boned, and rather inclined to leanness. He was very stout and active for a man of his size, for it was said by himself and others that he had never found an Indian who could keep up with him in a race or throw him down at wrestling. His eye was quick and penetrating, and his voice was of that harsh and powerful kind, which among Indians always commands attention. His health had been uniformly good. He never was confined by sickness, till he was attacked with the consumption 4 years before his death. And although he had from his earliest days been inured to almost constant fatigue and exposure to every inclemency of the weather, in the open air he seemed to lose the vigor of the prime of his life only by the natural decay occasioned by old age. Chapter 12. Her troubles renewed, John's jealousy towards his brother Jesse, circumstances attending the murder of Jesse Jemison, her grief, his funeral, age, filial kindness. Being now left a widow in my old age to mourn the loss of a husband who had treated me well and with whom I had raised 5 children, and having suffered the loss of an affectionate son, I fondly fostered the hope that my melancholy vicissitudes had ended, and that the remainder of my time would be characterized by nothing unpropitious. My children, dutiful and kind, lived near me, and apparently nothing obstructed our happiness. But a short time, however, elapsed after my husband's death before my troubles were renewed with redoubled severity. John's hands having been once stained in the blood of a brother, it was not strange that after his acquittal, every person of his acquaintance should shun him, from a fear of his repeating upon them the same ceremony that he had practiced upon Thomas. My son Jesse went to Mount Morris, a few miles from home, on business in the winter after the death of his father, and it so happened that his brother John was there, who requested Jesse to come home with him. Jesse, fearing that John would commence a quarrel with him on the way, declined the invitation and tarried overnight. From that time, John conceived himself despised by Jesse and was highly enraged at the treatment which he had received. Very little was said, however, and it all passed off, apparently until sometime in the month of May, 1812, at which time Mr. Robert Whaley, who lived in the town of Castile, within 4 miles of me, came to my house early on Monday morning to hire George Chongo, my son-in-law, and John and Jesse to go that day and help him slide a quantity of boards from the top of the hill to the river, where he calculated to build a raft of them for the market. They all concluded to go with Mr. Whaley and made ready as soon as possible, but before they set out, I charged them not to drink any whiskey, because I was confident that if they did, they would surely have a quarrel in consequence. They went and worked till almost night, when a quarrel ensued between Chongo and Jesse, in consequence of the whiskey that they had drank through the day, which terminated in a battle, and Chongo got whipped. When Jesse had got through with Chongo, he told Mr. Whaley that he would go home, and directly went off. He, however, went but a few rods before he stopped and lay down by the side of a log to wait, as was supposed, for company. John, as soon as Jesse was gone, went to Mr. Whaley with his knife in his hand and bade him to be gone, at the same time telling him that Jesse was a bad man. Mr. Whaley, seeing that his countenance was changed, and that he was determined upon something desperate, was alarmed for his own safety, and he turned toward home, leaving Chongo on the ground drunk, near to where Jesse had lain, who had by this time had gotten up and was advancing toward John, and Mr. Whaley was soon out of hearing of them, but some of his workmen stayed till it was dark. Jesse came up to John and said to him, "You want more whiskey and more fighting?" And after a few words went at him, to try in the first place to get away his knife. In this he did not succeed, and they parted. By this time the night had come on, and it was very dark. Again they clenched, and at length in their struggle they both fell. John, having his knife in his hand, came under, and in that situation gave Jesse a fatal stab with his knife, and repeated the blows till Jesse cried out, "Brother, you have killed me," quit his hold, and settled back upon the ground. Upon hearing this, John left him, and came to Thomas's widow's house, told them that he had been fighting with their uncle, whom he had killed, and showed him his knife. Next morning, as soon as it was light, Thomas's and John's children came and told me that Jesse was dead in the woods, and also informed me how he came by his death. John soon followed them and informed me himself of all that had taken place between him and his brother, and seemed to be somewhat sorrowful for his conduct. You can better imagine what my feelings were than I can describe them. My darling son, my youngest child, him on whom I depended, was dead, and I in my old age left destitute of a helping hand. As soon as it was consistent for me, I got Mr. George Jemison, of whom I shall have occasion to speak, to go with his sleigh to where Jesse was and bring him home, a distance of about 3 or 4 miles. My daughter Polly arrived at the fatal spot first. We got there soon after, though I went the whole distance on foot. By this time, Chongo, who was left on the ground drunk the night before, had become sober and sensible of the great misfortune which had happened to our family. I was overcome with grief at the sight of my murdered son, and so far lost the command of myself as to be almost frantic, and those who were present were obliged to hold me down from going near him. On examining the body, I was found that it had received 18 wounds so deep and large that it was believed that either of them would have proved mortal. The corpse was carried to my house and kept till the Thursday following, when it was buried after the manner of burying white people. Jesse was 27 or 8 years old when he was killed. His temper had been uniformly very mild and friendly, and he was inclined to copy after the white people, both in his manners and his dress. Although he was naturally temperate, he occasionally became intoxicated, but never was quarrelsome or mischievous. With the white people he was intimate, and learned from them their habits of industry, which he was fond of practicing, especially when my comfort demanded his labor. As I have observed, it is the custom among the Indians for the women to perform all the labor in and out of doors, and I had the whole to do, with the help of my daughters, till Jesse arrived to a sufficient age to help us out. He was disposed to labor in the cornfield, to chop my wood down, milk my cows, and attend to any kind of business that would make my task lighter. On the account of his having been my youngest child, and so willing to help me, I am sensible that I loved him better than I did either of my other children. After he began to understand my situation and the means of rendering it more easy, I never wanted for anything that was in his power to bestow. But since his death, as I have had all my labor to perform alone, I have constantly seen hard times. Jesse shunned the company of his brothers and the Indians generally, and never attended their frolics, and it was supposed that this, together with my partiality for him, were the causes which excited in John so great a degree of envy that nothing short of death would satisfy it. So that is the end of chapter 12. And I will continue on tomorrow. Bye.